A single mom's daughters followed the same old man to his garden. He was growing something more than flowers. There is a particular kind of person who becomes invisible not because they want to be, but because the world has simply stopped looking. Not the dramatic invisibility of someone who has withdrawn or hidden. The quiet invisibility of someone who was once very present, who took up space, who was needed, who had a place in the daily architecture of other people's lives, and then, gradually, wasn't anymore. Not through any single event. Just through the accumulation of time and change and the way the world reorganizes itself around absences without anyone deciding to. Edgar Lim was that kind of person. I didn't know this when I first noticed him. I noticed him the way you notice things that repeat without explaining themselves, reliably, consistently, in the early morning when the street was still mostly quiet and Nora and June and I were on our way to school. An old man, mid-70s at least, moving slowly along the pavement with a canvas bag over one arm and the particular unhurried quality of someone who has nowhere urgent to be. Every morning. The same direction. The same canvas bag. The same quiet passage through the neighborhood like something the street had always contained. My daughters noticed him differently. They always do. It was June who said it first, on a Thursday morning in early September when the light had that particular quality of the season shifting, warm still but with something cooler underneath it. He goes the same way every day, she said. I know, I said. Where does he go? I didn't know. I said so. She thought about this for the rest of the walk to school in the focused way she thought about things that had caught her attention and not yet let it go. I could see it in her face, the slight frown, the occasional glance back over her shoulder toward the direction the old man had gone. Filing it. Considering it. Waiting for the right moment to do something about it. Nora, beside her, had already opened her notebook. She was writing something I couldn't quite see. When I asked later, she showed me, old man, canvas bag, September mornings. Goes somewhere. Nobody follows. Question, why? She was 7 years old. She considered unanswered questions a form of incompleteness that required correction. His name was Edgar Lim. He was 74 years old. He had been a secondary school science teacher for 38 years, at the same school 4 streets away, until his retirement 3 years ago. He had taught biology and chemistry and, for a period in the 90s, a combined earth sciences course that the school had eventually discontinued. He had been, by all accounts including his own, a good teacher. The kind students remembered. The kind who stayed late and answered questions that weren't on the curriculum and noticed when someone was struggling before they'd said so. I learned all of this later. What I knew that first Thursday in September was only that my daughters had, with their characteristic refusal to let anything unexplained remain unexplained, begun a quiet project of observation that I hadn't authorized and couldn't reasonably stop. Where does he go? June had asked. The answer, as it turned out, was 3 streets away, to a community garden that occupied what had once been a vacant lot and had been transformed, over about 15 years, into something extraordinary. Raised beds, fruit trees, a small greenhouse at the far end, paths between the beds made of salvaged brick. The kind of garden that takes a very long time and a great deal of stubborn attention to become what it is. Edgar had a plot there. Had one for 12 years, since before his retirement, tended on weekends and school holidays, and then, after retirement, every single morning without exception. My daughters followed him there on a Saturday morning without telling me until they were already gone. I want to be accurate about how I felt when I realized what had happened. I was standing in the kitchen making coffee when I noticed the apartment was too quiet. Not the quiet of children occupied, the specific quiet of children absent. I checked the living room, the bedrooms, the bathroom. I went to the front door. Their shoes were gone. The note on the kitchen table, in Nora's careful printing, said, "We followed the old man. He went to a garden. We are being safe. Back by breakfast. Nora and June." I stood there for a moment with the note in my hand and went through the full sequence of emotions available to a parent in this situation: alarm, then relief at the note's existence, then the particular exasperation of someone whose children are simultaneously irresponsible and thoughtful enough to leave a note about their irresponsibility. I put on my shoes and went after them. The community garden was 3 streets away. I heard my daughters before I saw them. Specifically, I heard June's voice, which carries in the particular way of people who have never learned to modulate their enthusiasm. She was talking to Edgar. He was crouching beside one of the raised beds with the ease of someone whose body has done this 10,000 times, examining something in the soil. June was beside him, crouched in the same position, looking at whatever he was looking at. Nora was standing slightly back, notebook out, writing with intense concentration. Edgar heard me come through the gate and looked up. His expression was the one I'd come to recognize, the mild surprise of someone who had been found somewhere they'd assumed they were alone, recalibrating quickly. He said, "Yours?" I said, "Unfortunately." He looked at June, who was still examining the soil with complete absorption. She had asked him 3 questions in the last 5 minutes, he told me later. About the soil composition, about what he was looking for, about why that particular bed had different colored earth than the others. He had answered all 3 in detail, because that was the kind of person he was, and she had followed up on each answer with another question, because that was the kind of person she was. Nora looked up from her notebook. She said, "His name is Edgar. He's been coming here for 12 years. He was a science teacher. He knows everything about soil." She said this last part with a reverence that suggested soil knowledge ranked very highly in her estimation of a person. Edgar looked at her with the expression teachers get when they encounter a child who is paying the kind of attention most children don't. Careful, slightly wondering. He said, "Not everything, but quite a lot." We stayed for 2 hours that first Saturday morning, which was not what I had planned. I had planned to collect my daughters and apologize and leave. What happened instead was that Edgar began explaining what he was doing, not performing, not lecturing, just explaining in the way that people who love something explain it when someone asks, and my daughters listened with the complete attention they gave to things that had genuinely caught them, and I sat on the salvage brick path and drank the coffee I'd brought, and found myself listening too. He was preparing the beds for autumn planting. This involved a specific sequence of things: clearing, turning, amending the soil with compost he'd been building in a corner bin since spring, assessing what had been there before and what the ground needed now. He talked about soil the way some people talk about music, as something with texture and character and history, something you learn to read over time. Nora was writing everything down. June was asking about the greenhouse. I was thinking about the 38 years of students who had sat in his classroom and whether any of them had understood that they were being taught by someone who saw the world this way, as a system of interconnected things, each one legible if you paid attention, each one worth paying attention to. I said, "Did you always have this garden?" He said, "I had a smaller one when I was teaching. This one came after I retired." He paused. "I needed somewhere for the mornings." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "When you've structured your life around a certain kind of purpose for nearly 40 years, and then the purpose ends, the official purpose, the paid purpose, you discover that the structure doesn't automatically transfer to something else. I needed somewhere to go in the mornings. Somewhere that needed me to show up." He said it simply, without self-pity, as a fact about how retirement had worked for him. But I heard something in it that I recognized, the particular quality of someone describing a loss they've learned to work around rather than one they've resolved. The garden became part of our Saturdays. Not every Saturday. I was a single mother with a full week of teaching behind her, and a long list of things that needed doing on weekends. But most Saturdays, often enough that Edgar began to expect us, that he started arriving slightly later on the mornings he knew we'd be coming so our hours would overlap. This was something Nora noticed and documented before I did. Edgar update October. He arrives at 8:30 on Saturdays now instead of 7 o'clock. This is because we come at 8:30. He adjusted his schedule for us. Observation: this is what it looks like when someone wants company but won't ask for it directly. She showed me the entry on a Sunday morning. I read it twice. I said, "That's very observant." She said, "I know. It's also a little sad." I said, "Why sad?" She thought about it. Because he shouldn't have to adjust his schedule to make it look accidental. He should just be able to say come on Saturday mornings. She paused. But some people don't know they're allowed to ask for things. I thought about that for the rest of the day. Edgar had been married for 41 years to a woman named Patricia, who had died 5 years before his retirement. They had 2 children, a son in Singapore, a daughter in Edinburgh, who called regularly and visited at Christmas and were, by Edgar's account, good people who lived their lives at a considerable distance from his. He didn't describe this as loneliness. He described it as the shape his life had taken, the way you describe a geographical fact. The river goes this way, the road goes that way, this is where things are. But there was something in the description that sat beside the word loneliness without quite touching it. He had retired into a life that had Patricia's absence in it, and his children's distance in it, and 38 years of daily purpose suddenly gone, and the garden was what he'd built to hold all of that in some kind of livable shape. He came every morning because the garden needed him to. Because the beds required attention and the compost required turning and the greenhouse required monitoring, and all of these requirements were a structure he could inhabit when the other structures had ended. I understood this in a way I hadn't expected to. After Daniel left, I had understood the importance of structure in a new way, the routines that kept going not because they were meaningful but because meaning would find them later if you kept showing up. The school run, the park bench Tuesdays and Thursdays, the lesson plans, the parent-teacher evenings. The doing of the things even when the doing felt hollow, because hollow doing was better than not doing, and eventually the hollow filled. The garden was Edgar's hollow doing. 3 years in, it had filled with something extraordinary. He just couldn't see it from the inside. October brought a conversation I hadn't expected. We were in the greenhouse, Edgar showing June the particular conditions he maintained for the seedlings he started in autumn for spring planting. The light was different in there, warmer, the smell of soil and green things concentrated. Nora was at the far end with her notebook, cataloging varieties with the seriousness of a field researcher. Edgar said, without particular preamble, "I used to do this with students." The greenhouse. We had a smaller one at the school, barely functional, but I ran a voluntary group on Friday afternoons. Grow your own. We grew tomatoes, herbs, some more ambitious things that didn't always work. He paused. About 12 students at its peak. More some years. I said, "What happened to it?" "Budget cuts, eventually. And then I retired and there was no one to run it, and it stopped." He said it without bitterness. As a fact. But I noticed what he did with his hands when he said it. The same slow turning motion I'd learned to recognize in people who were managing something they'd become skilled at managing. I said, "Do you miss it? The teaching?" He was quiet for a moment. "I miss the particular attention of young people who are interested in something," he said. "You can't manufacture it. When a student is genuinely curious, really wanting to know, not performing interest for a grade, there's nothing quite like it." He glanced at June, who was asking the seedlings questions under her breath, apparently interviewing them. "It's quite rare, actually." I said, "You have 2 of them every Saturday." He looked at me. Then back at June. Then at Nora, still cataloging. He said, "I know. He stopped. He started again. "It means more than I know how to say," he said. Plainly. Without the careful management. It means more than I know how to say. November arrived and the garden went into its winter mode. Less to do in the beds, more to do in planning and preparation, the particular patience of a gardener who understands that the quiet months are part of the work. Edgar shifted his mornings to the greenhouse and the planning notebook he kept, a battered thing full of diagrams and notes going back years. He showed it to Nora one Saturday, and she looked at it with the reverence of someone encountering a system she deeply respected. She said, "This is like my building record but for plants." He said, "Exactly like that, yes." She said, "Can I have a section? In mine? For the garden? I want to document things." He said, "I would consider that an honor." The garden record began that Saturday. Nora cross-referenced it with the garden's own history, asking Edgar questions about what had grown where in previous years, building a picture of the plot's development that went back to when he'd first taken it on. Edgar answered every question with the patience and precision of someone who had been asked good questions by students for 38 years and still found good questions among the best things a day could contain. June planted things. This was her contribution, not documentation but action, the physical work of putting things in the ground and being present for what happened next. Edgar gave her her own small section of a bed. She chose what to grow with the decisiveness she brought to all choices and the willingness to be wrong that she brought to fewer things but was learning. I weeded. This was my function, arrived at organically. I was not a natural gardener and made no claims to being one, but weeding required no expertise and the garden needed it done and I had hands and time and found, to my surprise, that I didn't mind it. There was something in the pulling of the unwanted things, the clearing of space, that satisfied something I hadn't known needed satisfying. Edgar watched me weed one morning and said, "You're good at that." I said, "It's the only thing I'm good at in here." He said, "It's more important than it looks. Half of gardening is removing what shouldn't be there. The other half is patience." I thought about that outside the garden too. December brought something I hadn't anticipated. Edgar's son David came from Singapore for Christmas. A week's visit, the annual one. I met him briefly at the garden gate on a Saturday morning, a man in his mid-40s who had Edgar's careful eyes and a quality of slightly guilty attentiveness, the specific look of adult children who know they don't visit enough and are trying to compensate within the visit for the accumulated absence. He was surprised by us. Not unpleasantly, just surprised. He said to his father, "You didn't tell me about them." Edgar said, "I didn't know how to explain it." David looked at my daughters, who were already in the garden, June investigating the winter beds with the focus of someone checking on patience, Nora updating the garden record with the seriousness of someone filing an official report. He said, "How long has this been going on?" "Since September," Edgar said. David was quiet for a moment. He looked at his father with an expression I couldn't quite read from where I was standing, something between relief and something more complicated. He said, "You seem different, Dad." "Since last Christmas." Edgar said, "I suppose I am?" David said, "Good different." Edgar looked at the garden, at my daughters in it, at the winter light on the salvaged brick paths. He said, "Yes. Good different. I want to tell you about a conversation Nora had with Edgar in January, because it matters. It was a cold Saturday, the kind where you can see your breath, and we were in the greenhouse where it was warmer. June was repotting seedlings with the intense focus she brought to physical tasks. Nora was reviewing the garden record, cross-referencing something with Edgar's planning notebook. She looked up and said, "Edgar, do you know that you're a teacher here?" He looked at her. She said, "I know you retired. But you teach us every Saturday. You taught me about soil pH and companion planting and why the compost has to be turned. You taught June about germination." She paused. "You're still a teacher. You just changed classrooms." Edgar was very still for a moment. She said, looking back at her notebook, "I'm putting that in the garden record. Under observations." He didn't say anything for a while. When he did, his voice was slightly different, careful, like he was handling something that could break. He said, "I didn't think of it that way." She said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you." She wrote it down. Then she looked up again and said, "Also your classroom is better than the old one because it has plants in it, and you don't have to grade anyone." He laughed. The full laugh, the one that had taken until October to emerge fully, that changed his whole face. He said, "That is an excellent point." June, repotting a seedling with great concentration, said without looking up, "And your students are smarter." He laughed again. I did too, from the greenhouse doorway. It was January and cold, and the garden was mostly waiting, and in the greenhouse the seedlings were beginning their long, patient preparation for spring, and Edgar was laughing in a way that had taken 3 years of solitary morning visits to arrive at, and my daughters were the reason, which was not a surprise, but was still, every time, something that moved me more than I knew how to say. Spring came to the garden in the way spring always comes, not all at once but in increments, one thing at a time, until enough things had changed that you looked around and realized it had arrived without announcing itself. June's bed bloomed first. She had planted bulbs in October with the decisiveness of someone who had done their research and made their choices, and in March they came up, not in the neat rows she'd planned exactly, because gardening rarely obeys plans exactly, but close enough, and colorful, and very much alive. She stood looking at them for a long moment. Then she turned to Edgar and said, "I made that." He said, "You did?" She said, "From nothing?" He said, "From bulbs?" Which is almost nothing. She considered this. Almost nothing, she agreed. And then she grinned, the full unguarded grin of a child who has been surprised by her own capability, and Edgar grinned back, and I took a photograph because some things deserve to be kept. Nora's garden record entry for that day reads, "June's bulbs came up." She looked at them like she couldn't believe she'd done it. Edgar looked at her like he couldn't believe it either, but also like he'd known all along. Observation: this is what it looks like when someone helps you find out what you can do. It's different from being taught. It's more like being accompanied. She was right. It was more like being accompanied. Edgar's daughter came in April, flying in from Edinburgh for a long weekend. Her name was Michelle, and she was warmer than David had been initially, quicker to laugh, less burdened by the guilt of distance, or perhaps just more practiced at holding it lightly. She came to the garden on the Saturday and met us there, and she and I sat on the brick path with coffee while Edgar showed my daughters the spring progress with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting to show someone. She said, "He talks about your girls on the phone?" "Every week." I said, "He does?" She said, "Nora's garden record?" "June's questions." "He reads us entries sometimes." She paused. "We were worried about him after Mum died and then after he retired. He was managing. You know the difference." I knew the difference. She said, "And then he started mentioning Saturday mornings and it was different. The way he talked about it. He sounded present. Like he was actually in his life instead of just running it." I said, "I think he was always present. He just needed somewhere to bring it." She looked at him across the garden, crouched beside June, explaining something about the soil with his hands, patient and precise and clearly exactly where he wanted to be. She said, "Thank you for showing up." I said, "We followed him here. My daughters followed him without asking me first." She smiled. "Smart girls," I said, "occasionally irresponsible. But yes. The garden is different now than it was that first September morning when my daughters followed an old man 3 streets from our building to find out where he went. It looks the same, mostly. Same raised beds, same fruit trees, same greenhouse. But it holds more people now. Edgar's plot has become, informally and without anyone deciding it should, a place that includes us. Our Saturday mornings are in his planning notebook alongside the planting schedules and soil amendments, not written there officially, just present in the way he accounts for the hours, the way a person accounts for the things that organize their week. June has expanded her bed section. She negotiated this with Edgar in March with the seriousness of a property transaction, and he agreed with the gravity that matched hers. She has opinions about what she grows now, informed opinions, the opinions of someone who has failed at some things and learned from the failure, and tried again. Nora's garden record is 47 entries long. Edgar has read all of them. He has occasionally, gently, suggested corrections to the scientific terminology, which Nora has accepted with the graciousness of someone who considers accurate information more important than being right. I still weed. I have gotten better at it, which Edgar says is inevitable. You can't do something 47 Saturdays in a row without getting better at it whether you mean to or not. I have started to have opinions about the weeding, preferences about approach, a sense of the garden as something I know rather than just something I'm present in. This is, I think, how it always happens. You show up. You keep showing up. Eventually the showing up becomes something. Edgar said something to me in May, on a morning when the garden was fully alive with spring and my daughters were somewhere in it doing things I couldn't quite see, and the light was doing something worth sitting still for. He said, I have been thinking about what Nora said. About the classroom. I said, which part? He said, that I changed classrooms. He was quiet for a moment. I spent 3 years thinking I had finished something. That the teaching part of my life was a completed chapter. And I was grieving it, I suppose, without quite knowing that was what I was doing. Treating the garden as compensation rather than continuation. I waited. He said, it isn't compensation. It's continuation. Different students, different classroom, different subject in some ways. But the same thing underneath, someone wanting to understand how the world works and someone else willing to help them. He paused. That doesn't end because a contract ends. I just couldn't see it without someone pointing at it. A 7-year-old pointed at it, I said. He smiled. The best observations often come from the people who haven't yet decided what's worth observing. He looked across the garden to where Nora was now visible, kneeling beside a bed with her notebook, taking her measurements and her notes, and her careful account of things. She noticed things that deserved to be noticed. That's rarer than it sounds. It is, I said. We sat in the garden in the May light, the two of us, a retired teacher and a single mother, both of us further along in our lives than we'd expected to be alone, both of us found by the same 2 children who had not yet learned to walk past people without wondering where they were going. The garden grew around us. The seedlings June had started in the greenhouse and February were in the ground now, beginning their slow patient work. The compost bin was full. The planning notebook was open on the brick path between us. There was nowhere we needed to be. There was exactly here, which was enough, which had always been enough, if you were willing to follow a stranger down a quiet street on a September morning to find out where he went. My daughters were willing. They always are. The rest of us are learning. I want to say something about what it means to be found by children. Not rescued. Not fixed. Found, in the specific sense of being noticed by someone who had no reason to notice you, who gained nothing from the noticing, who simply looked in your direction and decided you were worth looking at and kept looking. Edgar had been coming to the garden every morning for 3 years before my daughters followed him. 3 years of solitary mornings, of doing the work alone, of being present in a place that required his presence, and returned it in the way plants return presence, reliably, quietly, without language. He had built something extraordinary, and had no one to show it to in the daily way. His children were far. Patricia was gone. The students who had once asked him questions had graduated and moved on. He was visible to anyone who looked. Nobody looked. My daughters looked. I think about this often, the particular combination of availability and willingness that makes someone capable of really seeing another person. Children have it more reliably than adults because they haven't yet accumulated the reasons not to. They haven't learned that looking is an imposition, that staying is an intrusion, that the polite thing is to give people their privacy even when their privacy is actually their isolation. Nora and June knew none of this. They saw an old man with a canvas bag going somewhere interesting and followed him, because interesting things deserved following and people who went somewhere every day deserved to have someone wonder why. The wondering was the whole thing. the willingness to wonder. There is a moment from October that I keep returning to. We had been at the garden for about 2 hours, and the afternoon light was doing the thing it does in autumn, low and gold and making everything look slightly more significant than usual. Edgar was showing June how to test soil acidity with a kit he'd had for years, explaining the numbers and what they meant. June was listening with the complete attention she gave to things she'd decided were important. And Edgar was teaching. Not in the self-conscious way, not performing expertise. Just teaching the way he must have taught for 38 years, when it was the thing he was and not the thing he used to be. The unhurried explanation. The checking that she'd understood before moving on. The follow-up question that tested understanding without testing the child. I watched this and felt something that took me a moment to identify. It was grief, actually. A small, clean grief for all the mornings before September, for the 3 years of solitary hours that had been spent doing necessary work alone when they could have been this. For the questions that hadn't been asked and the answers that had waited in Edgar with nowhere to go. And alongside the grief, something else. The particular gratitude of someone who has arrived somewhere late, and is choosing to be grateful for the arrival rather than regretful about the lateness. We were there now. That was what mattered. June asked Edgar in November whether he ever got lonely. She asked it the way she asked everything, directly, without cushioning. Edgar had learned by then that June's questions deserved direct answers, that she had a very precise instrument for detecting when someone was managing instead of answering. He said yes. Particularly in the mornings before the garden. When I wake up and the apartment is quiet and the day hasn't started yet, and there's a moment where the quiet is just quiet and not peaceful. June nodded. Before we came? He said, before you came, yes. Less so now. She said, because now you know we're coming? He said, because now I know you're coming. She seemed satisfied. Then she said, we're coming next Saturday too, so you can know that already. He said, I'll make note of it. She said, and the Saturday after? He considered. You could just make a standing note, she said. Every Saturday. Then you don't have to keep making individual notes. He looked at her with that expression, part amusement, part something deeper. Something that had to do with being cared for by someone who expressed care through logistics. He said, that is a very efficient solution. She said, I know, and went back to what she was doing. He looked at me. I said, she's always been like this. He said, I know. I'm grateful for it. By the following spring, 5 people were tending plots where there had been 3 when we first arrived. Mrs. Park from 2 streets over had taken on a bed for the Korean chili she'd wanted to grow for years. Edgar had prepared the soil for her, advised on the light, checked in every Saturday. Nora updated the garden record, spring overview. The garden is bigger now. Not the physical garden, the same size. But more people in it. Edgar says gardens are supposed to be shared, that the whole point is growing things for more than just yourself. Observation. I think he means more than vegetables. He did mean more than vegetables. I want to end with a Saturday in June, the second year, 9 months in, when the ease of the garden had settled into something that felt, without any of us deciding it should, permanent. Edgar sat beside me on the bench by the greenhouse while my daughters worked their beds. He looked at the plots and the paths and the fruit trees and the growing things. He said, I keep thinking about what Nora said. About the classroom changing. I said she's said it a few times now. He said, every time I understand it slightly differently. When I retired I thought I was finishing. 38 years and then, finished. And for 3 years the garden has been good, but I've been here alone and it felt like the good thing you do after the real thing ends. The consolation. I waited. He said, it isn't consolation. It's the same thing. Different form, different students, different classroom with considerably better air quality. He smiled. But the same purpose underneath. Someone curious. Someone helping. Something growing. He looked at June, who was explaining her planting choices to a bee that had landed on her arm, apparently conducting the interview in reverse. He said, "I didn't know I still had this in me." After Patricia. After the school. I thought the having was finished. I said, "It wasn't finished. It was waiting." He said, "Your daughters found it." I said, "They're good at finding things people have set down and forgotten they're allowed to still have." He nodded. Picked up his tea. The garden was warm around us, full of growing things and two small girls and the particular Saturday morning quality of a week that had asked a great deal of everyone and was now asking nothing. We sat in it. The garden grew. My daughters moved through it like they belonged there. Because they did. Because belonging is what happens when you show up enough times and care enough about what you find. Nora will write it in the garden record. She writes everything down. June will grow things that surprise her. Edgar will be there at 8:30, thermos in hand, because someone is coming and the morning matters, and this is what it looks like when a life that thought it was finished finds out it was only resting. We will be there too. We always are. There is one more thing I haven't told you, about what the garden did for me, not for Edgar, not for the girls, but for me specifically. I had been a teacher for 11 years when all of this began. I knew the inside of a classroom the way Edgar knew the inside of a garden, the rhythms of it, the particular quality of attention in a room of young people who are or aren't with you, the difference between a lesson that lands and one that slides past everyone including you. I loved it mostly. Some days I loved it entirely. But I had been teaching in a way that had gotten slightly automatic, the way things get when you've done them long enough that the muscle memory takes over and the genuine presence fades. The garden gave that back. Not by showing me something I didn't know. By showing me the same things I'd always known through someone else's eyes, through Edgar's relationship with his students, through the way he taught Nora and June without a curriculum, or a grade, or any of the structures that teaching accumulates around itself over years. The pure version of it. Someone curious, someone helping, something growing. I went back to school in September, the second year, after a full summer in the garden, and my lessons were different. Not dramatically. Just the way that seeing something clearly from the outside changes how you do it from the inside. I slowed down. I asked more questions and gave fewer answers and waited longer for the answers to come. I stayed later. One of my students said in November that my class felt different this year. I said, "How?" She said, "Like you're actually here?" I thought of Edgar saying that to his son. Actually here. Present in the life rather than running it. I said, "I'm working on it." She said, "It's working." Nora's garden record has 73 entries now. The most recent one, written last Saturday in her careful printing that has gotten more elaborate with practice, reads, Garden Record, Year 2 Summary. Things that grew. June's bed expanded twice, the chili peppers, the autumn bulbs, the friendship between Edgar and Mrs. Park, who now arrive at the same time on Sundays and work side by side without talking much, which Edgar says is the highest form of gardening companionship. Things that didn't grow, the ambitious cucumber experiment, which we don't talk about. Things that grew that weren't plants, Edgar teaches again. Mama teaches differently. June learned to fail at things and start over. I learned that documentation is a form of love. She paused at the bottom of the page and added, observation. The garden is not about the garden. But also the garden is definitely about the garden. These are both true at the same time. Edgar read this entry sitting on the greenhouse bench on a warm September morning, 1 year and a week after my daughters first followed him through the gate. He read it twice, the way he read things that required rereading. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of his jacket, close to him. He said, "She's going to be something remarkable." I said, "She already is." He looked at where Nora and June were both in the garden now, working side by side on the bed they'd been sharing since spring, arguing with great seriousness about the merits of a planting decision that June had made unilaterally, and Nora considered poorly researched. "She already is," he agreed. The sun was doing something worth sitting still for. The garden was full. The thermos was warm between us on the bench, and the morning had nowhere it needed to go, and two small girls who had followed a stranger down a quiet street a year ago because they wanted to know where he went were in the middle of the thing they'd found, tending it, growing it, belonging to it. This is what it looks like when you follow your curiosity instead of your caution. This is what you find. This is enough, more than enough, it is everything.